Welcome to the Discerning the Forms podcast. I'm Nick.
I'm Anthony.
Welcome. I'm excited for our podcast topic tonight. And
it's something that's near and dear to our hearts.
Yeah.
And our journeys.
Yeah. So critiquing apologetics.
I think we kind of connected over.
We had.
We
were in a group.
Was that like our first sort of because we met over Facebook, obviously.
Yeah.
Like I said, obviously, like anybody else.
Like anyone else knows.
But we kind of connected through, I think.
Yeah.
The apologetics world, right? Like you were.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what group it was, but.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember which one?
There
was
some
it the Reformed
group.
Epistemology group?
Actually, I think it might have been. Yeah, that's it.
Could be because I started that group and then
because
I quit Facebook.
You and Shin was
I'm
in
no
there.
longer a moderator.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a fun group. Actually, it was one of my the more lively groups that we had. Now I'm hardly on. I mean, I'm on Facebook to talk to friends and post really random things, pictures of my kids.
Yep.
But back in that time, it was fun because you could get in those groups and really have good discussions.
It was popping off back in the day. Those were fun. Those were pretty fun times. Now that I sort of think about it, that was fun. But so today we're just gonna kind of episode 3, obviously, talking about apologetics, and it's a topic that I think it's sort of died down the past few years.
I think so.
Just for me,
I'll tell you what I think my reason for it is. Maybe after, but yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah,
that it's died down.
Because at one point, I remember it was just so fervent on Facebook and online, and I couldn't like escape it. Maybe it's because I was just really part of the world, and now that maybe we're both sort of out of it a little more, like I'm still aware of like peripheral stuff, but not in the way that like I said, I started the Reformed Epistemology group however many years ago that was, like, and it got really popular fast, and so which I found a lot of people who sort of not everybody in that group was like a Reformed epistemologist, but it tended to be a very friendly place because I think we all sort of had shared a lot of similarities, and because I've seen other apologetics forums that are just, I don't know, it's so unappealing to me and so aesthetically like nasty. I just I don't really. So but today we're going to talk about apologetics, and so just to we'll do kind of a run through of what apologetics is, different methods that are just popular, and then we'll kind of go through our stories and then go on from there. But so apologetics is just sort of sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say that for many of you who are listening, I'm not sure what your background is or where you're at. So we're coming at this as Christians, and we'll talk about our journeys with apologetics too. But I think you kind of recognize there's differences when you talk to different kinds of people doing different kinds of apologetics. And so we'll talk about that too, the differences. You kind of notice it when you're on the other side of the conversation.
Types.
Yeah.
There's personality types that get drawn to certain things, and
yeah,
it's really obvious what kind of personality types fit in the kind of group. So
yeah, so go ahead. You were going to define apologetics, and I stopped you.
Apologetics, right? So the word apologetics is rooted in the Greek word apologia, which just means defense, and it's sort of rooted in two things. One is obviously the letter of 1 Peter. He says, to give a defense for the hope that you have within you. This is sort of a guiding scripture verse for a lot of the apologetics world. And then Paul in the Areopagus in Acts 17 is sort of a really foundational narrative for giving a defense of the faith in terms of like philosophical, and as Paul was engaging Greek philosophers and even mentions Stoics in scripture, which I think is cool, and how Paul uses a Greek poet to point to the living God as like, hey, so this is, your poet says this, here's they had all these different spaces for different gods, and to the unknown God, he's like, this is the God I preached to you today. So it's like, a very specific kind of method that Paul uses. So very inspirational for the broader apologetics world.
The other thing too, the thing about it is with apologetics, especially in the Christian tradition, it has grown up out of that, trying to understand the faith, and then but really answering, it came out of that missional move, that Paul had as
Yeah.
he's setting up churches, and then from the martyrs as they're bearing witness. I think a Justin martyr
hmm
and others, so the early Christians, they're using it to kind of connect these stories of Jesus up with the Old Testament when they're talking to Jews, and like you said, outside of
Yeah.
Judaism, they're trying to connect up with other parts of culture and really answer things. And I don't know if you heard this, and I can't remember who said this. Maybe it was David Bentley Hart, but that really it was paganism had to play catch up later. They didn't have any kinds of
hmm
apologetics or arguments for God or things like that.
Or
It
their
came,
gods. Yeah.
yeah, it came as they were trying to defend their own views with Christians, and even the Jewish apologists and so forth kind of grow up out of this conversation
hmm
that Christianity starts. And I think part of it is Christianity makes this really big claim that Jesus is the Messiah, and those
hmm
prophecies have now been fulfilled in Christ, and I'm here to tell you about it. He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So
Well,
whatever,
especially with Paul,
yeah.
you see like a very sophisticated argument.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity takes on a very sophisticated form over the years. Even all from Paul to like even Thomas Aquinas, who's like, the five arguments for God and God's existence, and understanding philosophical categories and showing just I think he calls it, I think it's technically the five proofs. Um, so it's interesting to think that I think Hart may have said that. It sounds so familiar, but I can't peg the thinker. But it sounds like something Hart would say. It's like the pagans playing catch up, which I think it makes sense to me because when Christianity comes on the scene, it's a religion that seeks to, I mean, convert. I think is a good word. Oh, that, yeah, Philip Perry. That actually sounds more right. But like Christianity, the way that it functions, it's like it functions to bring people over, right? So Jesus is the Messiah, and so this is the word that you preach to people, and because other obviously like a lot of other religions aren't necessarily seeking to convert in the same way, where Christianity becomes very sophisticated and sort of this incarnational approach where it goes into every nation and culture, and it can become embedded and redeem what's good in culture, and then and
Yeah.
sometimes culture pushes back on that, and so it makes sense to me that there would be a catch-up period for other religions. So this is the different emphasis that Christianity like has as a religion. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I know that it where we're at today with apologetics. So if you kind of do a history of apologetics, we talked about the early
hmm
church and kind of what they did, but I mean, it like you said, it got more sophisticated. It got a lot
hmm
different during the Scholastic era.
Sure.
Can you explain some of that? Like how did apologetics kind of morph over time? I guess as Christians had different interlocutors and different
hmm
people they were trying to reach, and different kinds of
Yeah.
questions were being asked.
Well, I think part of it is just when Christianity, it's so, I don't want to say malleable, but it because of the way that what it is, it's about a way of being. So when Christianity enters into a specific time frame or period, it's sort of the essence of it is always still there, right? Like the triune God redeems the world from sin and death through the Son, and by the Son is how you are saved, and so that always sort of stays the same. And then through different periods of time, you have the early church is in a much more hostile scenario where Rome is like, the different emperors are killing them off, and because they see Christianity as like, I think, a form of atheism, where the Christians are rejecting the various gods that the Roman Empire has, and so they're causing like a political problem for Rome, because Rome uses its political power through its religious rituals, and practices. That's how Rome functions as an empire, is religiously. So then Christianity poses a threat that way, like Jesus posed a threat to, the Jewish rule, and even the Roman rule, even that's not necessarily what he was trying to do. Like, he wasn't trying to be a political revolutionary. It's just that his very presence, being the word of God,
Yeah.
was a threat to all the power, because he is power itself. He is the one through all things are created. So to me, it's like, if you look at the different thinkers, the Christian thinkers throughout time, whether it's like Justin Martyr or Irenaeus, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, even like Calvin, and like the way Luther would talk about things, and from even post Reformation stuff, and even now you see Christianity, and the way it's defended is often through the context of the intellectual culture, the context of where they are at the time, and they use what they have around, and the different thoughts and arguments. Christians will often have to just bear what they have where they are, and use what they have to defend the faith. And so that looks very different throughout time, obviously, and even nowadays, we're sort of in this postmodern weird, especially in like 2021, we're in a really weird spot.
Yeah.
Just as a culture, and because people, I think the whole secular idea is just, that thesis has just failed, I think, entirely, from 9/11 with the new atheists, and how now we're going to move past this sort of superstition, and religion is just violence and dangerous, and you just see it, like, atheism just doesn't fulfill people's deepest desires and longings, and that humanity is always desiring and longing for unity, and that unity is rooted in the eternal, and rooted in God, because we are created in his image. So atheism just, I think it's obviously so prevalent, and I still see it on Twitter from time to time. I'm like, oh, you people still think that? Like, you actually still think that this form of atheism is like tenable? And not to be overly judgmental, but there's sort of like, it's way too flat, and it's way too ignorant about religious tradition, religious history, and how science works, and again, these are all like conversations we can have later, but so just in terms, just to kind of do a wrap up of that, it's just like, the context determines how apologetics is done, I think, is probably the best way to think about the development of it.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I just, as you mentioned that, it's funny because I did, oh man, it was a few months ago, but this is 2020. So several months ago now, time's flying. And I was online. I can't remember what the deal was, what some group I was in, and this guy got on, and he was doing the old, new atheist, copy paste from infidels or something. And I forgot about, like, that's how long it's been that I think that's gone.
I know.
It's kind of fizzled out, that like it kind of like, oh, okay, you're one of these guys. And it's actually kind of easy. You run a kind of one, you kind of just let them talk until they run out of gas. But I just remembered that feeling of like, oh wow, things have changed because I haven't run into these guys for a while.
Yeah, the stuff I swim in now is just very different. Like, I'm not even. Not that I'm trying to create an echo chamber, but it's like, yeah, exactly. Right. It's just.
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad for those guys. Yeah,
you see it. Yeah.
Yeah, just the once you. It has I think there's a reason why it kind of was popular for a certain time amongst a lot of young people, and so we're elder millennials, and I remember that after 9/11, and then the early thousands, those guys were really popular, and you had everybody reading the Dawkins Delusion and losing their faith and that kind of thing over really goofy.
Right.
But yeah, we're definitely I think the climate has shifted, but so as we're talking about apologetics, you talked about just different contexts that we're in kind of determine
Mm-hmm.
how we're answering questions, really how we're trying to explain the Christian faith, because people are asking different questions. It definitely took a turn with the rise of science and technology. And what did that look like? So the Enlightenment, you see
Mm-hmm.
everybody's getting into science. Darwinism becomes a thing, and it becomes this kind of like cultural, especially here in
Yeah.
America, it creates a culture war between
Mm-hmm.
religious people. And so, what kind of shape did apologetics take as we get closer to our time? I'm thinking
Mm.
after the Enlightenment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what you have in the Enlightenment, which a lot of people will postmark that as like the when Descartes, I think therefore I am, sort of situates mind in a space where there's like a dualistic framework where the mind is something that's immaterial and the body is something separate from it, and that soul and mind, so Descartes is usually the marker for when the Enlightenment happens. And part of what I think the Enlightenment develops over time. That, so Descartes is kind of the maybe a catalyst for that philosophically, even though Descartes himself was a theist. I don't know if he was a Christian, but he was a theist. He believed in
He was a
God, and
Catholic,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, he's Catholic. So I think
In
he
fact, when
himself,
after he came up with
yeah.
that theory, he went and burned incense and candles to Mary. He was excited that he could
So
think
he
and
lived
doubt.
in it. Yeah, it's like he lived in a very different framework than we do now, right? So Descartes usually the boogeyman for a lot of people. And I was reading this guy named Paul Tyson, who's a really good kind of radical orthodoxy guy, who has a book called Seven Lessons on Magic. It's really fantastic. I highly recommend it. So he just talks about, even at Descartes' time, the cosmology of his time is very different than ours. So what he means by that is that the world is not at that time is not seen primarily as a material reality that has cause and effect. This comes with Newton. This comes with development in science over time and the way that the natural sciences develop. Then that sort of takes over um, the imagination of modernity, right? And modernity is part of the Enlightenment. It's the idea that what matters is ideas, and truth is made through inferences from empirical evidence and the accumulation of it. So like the way that our minds think, even now, our imaginations, not just our mind, but like the way that we imagine the world being, is so different even from Descartes' time, that like when Descartes says that, it's all undergirded by like spiritual cosmologies. Like you said, that he burned incense and was doing Marian devotions after. So that doesn't that like his spiritual cosmological framework that he was working under doesn't exist in our modern framework. Doesn't exist in the sense of like, I still think that is the case, that the spiritual hierarchy of the world is not just cause and effect by material things, but that the sky is filled with angels and demons, and the heavens and the earth, and the sort of biblical worldview. I don't want to worldview is a bad word. Imagination and cosmology, I think, is the right one. But how we have been so good, because especially the rapid growth of technology and science, especially in the 20th century and the 21st century, it makes the modern imagination more plausible. I guess I would, if I could use like a more softer language about it, it's like people can trust in the efficacy of technology in medicine. So like, why wouldn't we trust that to inform everything else? Like, I get why people think that, because it's an easy authority to believe in because it's tangible, quote unquote. But what undergirded science for so long was belief in God and belief that you can make the world true, and devotion to God is like the primary way. That's always how science was at least developed. And then you come into, you know, modernity with like Nietzsche, Derrida, and the sort of deconstruction of truth as a as an overarching transcendent reality from that to like truth is a context and language is always um how Derrida thought about language and literature and writing, right? Like there's nothing behind the text, as Derrida would say, which just means that however you interpret it, that's what it is in some sense. It's very like I'm not a Derrida scholar, and I'm not gonna like say that's like truly like that's fundamentally what it is, but it's essentially like what happens is people there are thinkers that their teaching and the way they think get away from them, and that's sort of what happened with Derrida and postmodernity. And then so how does apologetics look in sort of postmodernity, or do people even think we are in postmodernity? Are we still modern? This is a question that we can wrestle with, but
Mm-hmm.
so when it comes closer to us, I think we're certainly, especially now, in a framework. The way people imagine the world is, arguing with people rationally is not the way to go anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not, to me, a pathway
Mm-hmm.
to even conversation, even hard conversations, because the way that people imagine themselves, imagine the world,
Mm-hmm.
is so fluid that the idea, of being rational or having like principles can often be a distraction from what people think the world actually is. So I can unpack that more later, but
Yeah. I think what happens once you get to the after the Enlightenment, and as we kind of climb closer, 1800s, 1900s, and up into thousands, what you see is this, kind of all sorts of different methods and approaches, and I think some of that's coming from the fragmentation that in the imagination, the different things going on. So you're answering different questions in Christianity or having different approaches, but
yeah,
you get these kind of different trends. Some of them flowing from like, what was it, William Paley? I forget his name.
Paley,
The Divine Watchmaker thing, where he's trying to
yes,
use science and evidentialism, and then you have different schools like the Scottish common sense enlightenment that Thomas Reid and others that really influenced a lot of American old Princeton and kind of their ideas. And you have then of course just people just in different contexts trying to answer arguments from atheists. Why is there a problem, all those kinds of things. And
the problem of evil, this sort of
and
argument, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And it seemed like, and I don't know what your experience, and we'll get into our stories, but it seemed like, boy, it really, I mean, apologetics became this huge like industry, almost like publishers
Industry is a good way to
publishing
put
books.
it. Yeah. Industry is a good way to put it. That's what happened.
People riding circuits, college circuits, and we've talked about William Lane Craig before. Most Christians have heard about William Lane Craig by now, if stayed a Christian for a while and
yes,
have gone to seminary and stuff. So like
he's very popular.
Yeah, so there's it seems like it really is accumulating to this big thing. And so what are your thoughts there? And I guess just start there. I'm interested in thinking about how we kind of came to this like cumulative moment. It seems like about 10, 15 years ago, maybe even around that time, where there was just like so many books being published every day.
It is. I bought a lot of the books too.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, part of it is, to me, I think the new atheism, I think, obviously causes a pretty strong response from a lot of Christians, and I think Alvin Plantinga also has a lot to do with why Christian philosophy had any serious skin in the game at all. I think there's a lot of credit to be due to him to bringing it into sort of mainstream academia and philosophy. So And I mean, we could just go over a few of the popular methods, I think, just to, so in
Yeah.
terms of apologetic method,
Yeah. By
so
this
we're kind
time,
of,
yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to
no,
get
go
us
ahead.
out, derail
No,
us or
go
anything.
ahead. Yeah.
But
No,
yeah,
go ahead.
because once like I said, after the Enlightenment, as we get kind of closer, and now there's this big accumulation of all sorts of things. But
Mm-hmm.
not only that, but there's, especially, I guess we have to mention this too, as I'm thinking about it, with the rise of evangelicalism. Evangelicals were
Mm-hmm.
basically, the sons and daughters of fundamentalists. The
Mm-hmm.
early fundamentalists, and so
Yeah.
what, 40s, 50s, 60s. You have the rise of evangelicalism, and what's interesting is you discern a rise from different colleges and seminaries that are teaching apologetics in that time. And I'm thinking, at least in America, I'm sure it's in different places as well this way,
Mm-hmm.
but they're kind of developed these different methods. Some schools
Mm-hmm.
would hold to an evidentialist method, some would hold
Mm-hmm.
to, we'll talk about some of these different methods. um,
Yeah.
Different seminaries were known for different ones. Old
Yep.
Princeton, you had B.B. Warfield,
Mm-hmm.
who was
Very,
famous.
very
Yeah.
famous. Yep. Mm-hmm. He's
And
more of a theologian, I think, than an apologist, right?
yeah,
Like,
I think so. I mean,
classically.
yeah,
Yeah.
his paper on inerrancy, I think, is a kind of,
Oh, see, yes. No, so
yeah,
I was going to mention, I think it's
yeah.
important to mention the historical critical method that
Mm-hmm.
develops in the 18th and 19th century in New
Mm.
Testament studies and biblical
Oh,
studies, where,
absolutely. Yeah.
right? So I think this is a really, especially for evangelicals and sort of fundamentalist stuff, the historical critical method, which just means, I actually sent you that paper on Nietzsche and idealism. I sort of sketched some of that stuff out where you have Strauss and oh, it's escaping me right now. I'll have to look up the paper real quick. But so what happens is this
Yeah, I
method
know
of doing
you're
biblical studies happens where you know Jesus, what you see in the Bible is not really the historical Jesus, right? So that's just because the letters of Scripture, the letters and books in the Bible are like filled with the mythology of the culture. So all that stuff is fake. That's not real. That's just imaginative stories and narratives that are transposed onto this figure named Jesus. And so what you got to do is you have to get through the myth and you have to find the real historical Jesus.
yeah,
And
break
how they
open
do that, yeah,
the husk and get the kernel
right. And the
of the
kernel,
real historical Jesus.
yeah, with so much, so what that does, and I really, really dislike idealism and all that stuff. Um, and just being in seminary, I've encountered so much of the historical critical method that I think some of it is actually very useful, but some of it goes very far afield. And it actually, like, you sort of lose Christian orthodoxy when you start to adhere too much to it because they want to reduce Christianity to a moral framework because the truth of historical Jesus was a moral and ethical teacher. That's the truth of Christianity, not necessarily the myth of the resurrection, as Boltmann and some of these later theologians, these modern theologians, get to. Um, that you have to do away with that. That's not really what it's about. It's about the moral and ethical teachings of Christianity and what Jesus says how to live and treat your neighbor. And so you sort of reduce Christianity to this. So in that, you have the validity of the biblical narrative in question because of this method of doing inquiring into New Testament texts, and then you sort of question authorship and timings and dates of these letters, and so all that stuff starts to go in question. So this is where the sort of the inerrancy argument is coming from.
Yeah, the
It's trying to
divorce.
defend, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, kind of.
say more.
Yeah, what are normally kind of normal denominations, as they're kind of walking through into the 1800s and early 1900s, you kind of see this divorce between, what have been called the liberal church and the more fundamentalist church, which is based on a kind of a set of what was it, kind of like a book or a tract of several principles that
Mm-hmm.
they wanted to preserve that, like you said, have to do more with what the Gospels are teaching, at least from their perspective. Things like the not just things that were essential to like the creeds, but things like, Jesus was born of a virgin, or all these kinds of things. So they
Mm-hmm.
had sets of fundamentals of things that they thought real Christians, if you're going to be a Christian, real Christians will believe in this, and
Mm-hmm.
they were called the fundamentalists, whereas the
Yeah.
more liberal people were being influenced by this historical Jesus, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
critiquing the Western Christian church, and kind of entering more into a kind of a philosophical realm, getting into
Yeah.
Hegel and Darwin and stuff. um, and it
So I
kind of
mean,
created a
there is
tension in the
danger.
church.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's danger.
yeah,
Which makes, I mean, it makes sense if you're going to question the sort of fundamental elements of Christianity. You're going to cause a resistance to that.
yeah,
And I
right.
think some of that resistance goes too far
Mm-hmm.
in rejecting, I think, some necessary things that we need to
Mm-hmm.
deal with and that are okay. That don't,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they ruin the foundations of Christianity. But I say inerrancy itself is sort of a modern, you know, crisis response. I think that
Yeah.
it's like you have the one extreme of the historical, critical, liberal, and then you have the other extreme. And I'm like, it sort of like abandons a way of viewing even the world that I think it gives too much into modern categories
Well, I
for it
think
to actually
what's
be even
behind it,
successful, you know?
yeah, I think what's behind it, and this is a philosophical thing, I think is Newtonian physics. I mean, like, you get to, I know it sounds
Yeah,
weird, but
yes.
the physics of that time was influencing the way people saw the universe, this kind of billiard ball,
That's what I
physics.
mean. That's what I meant
Yeah,
earlier. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, exactly. So
Hmm.
basically, what you have is a picture that even the Christians and those standing for the faith, the fundamentalists, have of an interventionist God. God kind of builds the model,
Yes.
the system, and then he
Hmm.
tinkers with it. Boom, here's a
Yes.
resurrection. Boom, here,
Yeah.
and you you create this odd kind of, like you said, imagination or picture of the world,
Hmm.
and who we are in it. It is a worldview kind of thing,
Hmm.
and so that's interesting. But it creates a certain response within the Christians who are reacting to the questioning and those kinds of things,
Hmm.
um, which the historical critical approach brings with it, and then the new
Hmm.
physics, and then the new biology in Darwinism,
Yeah.
because
So there's like a triple threat.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's like a
it's a
triple
triple threat that's happening.
whammy. Yeah, and then culturally, I mean, Nietzsche is, you bring that out in the paper too, where
Hmm.
basically what he's kind of gathering is just the cultural climate of the time. He's basically, and then he's
Hmm.
responding to a certain kind of Christianity. I like that in your article, that he's responding to a Hegelianism, really.
Yes.
Kind
Sort of.
of.
Yeah. He's responding to a sort of German
Yeah.
idealist Christianity, which abandons a fair amount of orthodoxy, and
Yeah.
it's sort of what he's the reason why Nietzsche is so extreme is because he sees he thinks how dangerous this idea, if like Christianity, right, is completely foundationless, and if there is no historical, like, if Jesus really didn't rise from the dead, and then we
Mm-hmm.
try to impose this moral framework on people, it's the opposite of life itself.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Right.
And so Nietzsche kind of moves from one faith to another. He was a Christian, and then he moves this sort of Dionysian, like, pleasure, and you have the fullness of life is like engaging in it fully and not like inhibiting yourself. So it's like, see, he gives it sort of, and what a lot of people fail to understand, especially Christians responding to Nietzsche, who says like God is dead, which is like it's more of a cultural commentary than it
Oh
is
wait,
like,
are you
you know what I
talking
mean?
about the God is Dead movie? Have you seen that?
Yes. So the way they try to respond to Nietzsche in his God is Dead movies is like, oh, you missed the mark. You've missed entirely kind of what he's saying, because it's actually come to fruition pretty heavily in our days, just in terms of like we've abandoned, like the culture has abandoned God but still wants the principles. And you can't, when Nietzsche says once you take God away, you have to go away from the morality, because it's because they're tied, they're intimately linked. Sorry, this is not a podcast on Nietzsche, but what it does is it bears to show out how we respond to things. Is often we miss the mark because we don't seek to understand what the upside is saying, and Nietzsche's a good example of somebody who I think rightly reacted to the Christianity of his times. I don't agree with where he ends up, because I think Jesus rose from the dead and entered into the linear time frame that we're in, but so
Yeah.
I think it's worth sketching this out, because once we start, so now I want to kind of go through the methods, I think, a little bit, because that can broaden our conversation about just apologetics now. Because I think what's worth developing from sort of early church to now, you see how Christianity responds to different contexts. And these methods, I think, are all pretty modern in their like frameworks, right?
I was going to say one.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say one thing, because I was going to say it earlier and I forgot, because I felt like I had to talk a little more and bring us a little more closer. But I think too, what you'll notice what the evangelicals end up doing is they're responding often to the logical positivism.
Oh yeah.
And I think that becomes important as Christians are responding in much more of a modern context. So we talked about how it was different in the early church, Paul's time, or Justin Martyr, or even in Aquinas' time, in the medieval scholastic era. And because there's a different culture, different climate, and like you said, a different imagination, way we're seeing ourselves and our orientation to the world, who we are, different anthropology. And so now, once we get to the modern climate, we are responding to people like Bertrand Russell and and Anthony Flew and that kind of stuff. So okay, so what are the different methods?
Yeah, no, I think logical positivism is a really good thing to bring up, because the way they conceive of language and the way they think that any sort of metaphysical speculation is just, that has no meaning, because there's no verifiability in the empirical. So it's important to bring that up, because I think also planning it is to bring him up again. He is a huge factor in why that worldview sort of dissipated in the philosophy world, because of how baseless their claims are, because of how, and this is sort of the presuppositional method, but like, you assume the world is the way to be before you make that claim, right? You're always backloaded with all these ideas before you're even making a claim that like language is just, metaphysical language is just purely speculative. Like, that's not verifiable through your method of empirical verify. So it's like there's a circular logic.
You shot yourself in the foot, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So planning is a big part of why that starts to die. So God bless Alvin Plantinga.
Yes.
Good man. So in terms of like now what you have, these different methods, you have first probably the most popular approach is the classical method, which William Lane Craig is sort of the bastion of this method. It just means that so the classical method is you approach apologetics by, you want to use natural theology, which means that what is revealed in nature, right? Like the steadiness of the days, water, like all the sorts that you want to establish theism, which just means God created the world, and the world is rational. You want to you start out by establishing general theism first. You don't start off by arguing for the Christian God first. You start off by general theism, which just means that a non-distinct God, clearly the world was designed in such a way that it has to have a creator. And that's just general. And then you move on from there. You build the base around a general one, and then you build upon that to get to the Christian God.
Yeah, so you're
That's
kind of
a class.
stacking things up until to
Yes.
kind of get someone to the place where you can then share the gospel or something.
Yes, exactly.
uh,
So that's a class. The classical method is just a method of building,
mm-hmm.
and then you have sort of an evidentialism, which just is like it's a method that wants to use evidence as a way of grounding belief, and you rely on so like one thing you could say is like miracles. I'm getting some of this stuff from a book, the 5 Views of Apologetics book, which is a really good, helpful primer if you want to get more into this stuff.
Yeah, we'll do book recommendations at the end of the
Yeah, at the
podcast.
end of the podcast. But like, so say something like miracles don't presuppose God's existence, as many a classical apologist would say, um, but serves as like evidence for God. So like, there are things that happen in the world that can be used as evidence to point back to God, and however you want to go about that. I think whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew, uh, evidentialism seeks to use things we see, patterns we see in the world as evidence for X, Y, or Z. So,
Mm-hmm.
and it also focuses on historical and more inductive arguments, which just means rather than deductive, is which something you get from you put forth uh, an argument rather than getting something from somewhere that you put forth. So, and then there's the sort of cumulative case, which is more of a general term. Like you can think of somebody like C.S. Lewis as sort of a cumulative case apologist, even though I don't like using C.S. Lewis as an apologist because he's clearly like a literature guy who's just really brilliant. And actually, he's probably smarter than anybody that we'll ever know.
Yeah,
So
he was
he's sort
pretty
of
amazing.
like he's incredible, and I think I was in a pastor group I'm in at church. Our pastor was like, "Hey, we should read this." I don't know if it's a Great Divorce or what essay it is, but C.S. Lewis is so densely brilliant. I don't even think I even quite plumb the depths of what he was saying in that essay. And he himself is not like a trained philosopher or like theologian. He's right. He's a literature
Yeah.
guy who came to Christianity through J.R.R. Tolkien. But so cumulative case is just you use what is necessary in your conversations with people, right? So you're not like tied to one method in particular. You're just trying to accumulate from each, like kind of, I don't know if like the pick and choose kind of thing, but and it just means you take things from different realms and you try to make an accumulative case for the existence of God by almost any means that you can, rather than being tied to one thing or another.
Mm-hmm. So then, how would it differ from the stacking up kind of classical approach? I mean, they're similar, but
They're similar. I don't know if you're trying as a
someone.
cumulative case. You're not
Mm-hmm.
trying to establish like you're not going about it the same way.
So you're
Like
not
the
saying
classical
we got to
apologists, yeah,
prove theism first before we can, prove
yeah,
that this, this theology is true. Whereas
yeah. You're
the
not really trying to do that.
cumulative
No.
case is just kind of like, hey, whatever, all the different things kind of um, are making this more probable than not. This
Yes.
proposition
Yeah.
more probable than
Exactly.
not.
So you're not tied to like trying to start off with a foundation of yeah, like I said, like it differs from the classical, even though it's similar. I think in
Mm-hmm.
some ways, it's just, and even that, like even it's call it a cumulative case. It's like I I'm not sure if it's even the best way of thinking about that, but that's just in terms of like sort of reading I've done and
So
just
yeah, the
over,
apologists
yeah,
themselves are taking this view and saying this is our
yes,
method. We think it's the when we're teaching courses and writing books and literature showing people how to do
hmm
apologetics, we think you should use this
like this is the
accumulative
best
case
method, yeah.
model. Yeah.
Yeah, which can be a more general. You don't have to be necessarily a specialized. You don't have to be specialized in specific like philosophical fields or anything like that. You're
Okay,
just,
so you could be
I think it's
using
yeah.
it as
hmm
your own style of approach when you're
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's sort of a no, fluid, but so it's not as like cut and dry as all these other methods. It's a little more nebulous as a position. So, and then you get into the presuppositionalists, which how they would argue is like all meaning, thought, fact logically presupposes the God of the scriptures. Like everything presupposes the existence of the triune God. So they're not looking to like prove to you anything. Like they're starting from that fact.
Yeah, the
And
idea is
yeah,
the idea is like
the
idea there is like, well, we've been assuming the burden of proof this whole time. Like we have to stack up things and build it and everything. It's like, whoa, wait a second. No, we've already. It's God. God created God. We start with God, and 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 someone else has to prove their. Yeah, if you have atheism, well, you have to prove to us. You show us why that's more plausible or probable or valuable, and so you start with just where you're already at as a Christian, which is your belief in God and the triune God, and you're kind of using that as your starting point, your base, and then you're just kind of challenging someone else. Oh, okay, well then why am you do a better job basically, or here's how I can show that how this worldview contradicts and just isn't the best way, so I'm just staying within my Christian view. And
it's like they almost like are trying to argue, I don't know, from a negative, but like they're more interested in critiquing other worldviews than putting forth like the positive one would be like the Christian worldview, like this is the positive case that they'll have, but like what the presuppositionalists will do will try to show the inherent contradictions in every other worldview. Like they're going to point that out. That's the sort of presuppositional method. It's like when you're in a debate with a presuppositionalist, they're going to try to attack the coherence of your own perspective, your own view, rather than always trying to state the case for themselves. Like there's evidence for this. It's like they don't really care. That's not part of how they're going to handle arguing with people about defending the faith or.
When this came on the scene, wasn't it pretty shocking for Chris? I always remember, what was that Bonson-Stein debate that's always kind of fun to listen to, because the guy underprepared. He didn't even look up Bonson or even prepare for the debate, and because of that, he just kind of assumed he was going to be one of these classical guys. He just kind of
that dude is not ready for Bonson. That's for sure. I would even argue that Bonson might be the best representative of a presuppositionalist perspective.
Yeah.
Like if you really want to see like what the best of that has to offer, Greg Bonson is probably, and obviously that's and a name worth mentioning is Van Til, Cornelius Van Til, who's kind of the forebearer of the presuppositional method.
This kind of gradates into different ways of doing presuppositionalism too, because
it's true.
We were just kind of sketching a picture, but there were fierce debates. I mean, between like Van Til and a guy named Gordon Clark, who taught at Wheaton.
Gordon Clark, yep.
And which he was more of a he had more of a rationalist brand of presuppositionalism, and Van Til came more from the Dutch Reformed tradition. And so there were some clashes there. So they had different approaches there. Then you also have people like Francis Schaefer, who had all the presuppositional stuff, but he kind of also he actually kind of took a couple different interesting approaches, but was more interested in the dialogue and the conversation that he could have with different worldviews and different people, and tried to even bring in some of the other kinds of apologetics. So
he was more generous, a more generous presuppositionalist.
Yeah,
Schaefer was.
Yeah, and he interacted more with, there was the whole movement of the hippie movement back in the day, and they had Labrie, where they'd have they'd love just to have conversations with people, and so it was more dialogical.
That's funny. Yeah, that's funny. I forgot about Labrie. I forgot about that stuff. That's so funny. Later on, you have the Reformed Epistemology, which we mentioned earlier. That I started an actual Facebook group on, a Facebook group about Reformed Epistemology, which is kind of sort of a presuppositionalist approach. Although because Reformed epistemology is coming out of guys like Nicholas Wolterstorff and Alvin Plantinga, who are analytic philosophers, whereas Cornelius Van Til was more in a continental, because he's Dutch, comes from a more continental philosophical perspective. And I don't know if you mentioned that in the first episode or wherever it was, but just the different ways of even doing philosophy, right? So the analytic school is more about logic and sequence, and language is sort of neutral in a way, where continental are more focused on the development of language, the development in culture, and just very different ways of going about doing philosophy.
Yeah, in fact, it was actually Europeans who would call the philosophy of continental philosophy, this is just this philosophy of the continent. So it kind of started as a derogatory way to tell. I think these existentialists are Heidegger's doing something different than we are, but now most of that's kind of dissolved, and people, there's a different way.
Things have developed.
And it's different now.
Exhaust how much things has developed and how divergent certain things are. But so there's different. So the presuppositionalists, I would say, just to get more clarifying, is a more continental perspective, I think, at least in terms of its development and its rootedness in Van Til and sort of the Dutch continental tradition, and the Reformed epistemology, which Alvin Plantinga is sort of like the bastion of this, like William and Craig is for the classical view. It frames God can always be brought to the party first, right? Like, you can assume God exists before doing philosophy. Like, that's totally fine. Which again is sort of presuppositional in its initial approach. And then Plantinga would talk about the sensus divinitatis, which just means the sense of the divine, and that when your faculties are properly functioning, you can know the world is true, and that you can know who God is. But sin has caused and marred your faculties, and so you can't actually know the world always as true, and you can be deceived. So it sort of heavily leans on human rationality in that way. So it's a position for me that really was a life raft for me for a long time. That last approach, because none of the but so I guess here we can sort of get into
tell your story. So before we get into kind of maybe what we think is going on now, and maybe what do we think about apologetics now? It's 2021, and it's a crazy world.
It's been a minute. We're mid-30s now, so we're we're grizzled.
But go ahead. Tell me what. So you had this. Oh, let me just say one more thing about.
Please do.
Plantinga, just to comment. There's a similar approach, and you have to. I think it's important for the listeners to know, actually, Van Til and Plantinga, though they didn't go to school at the same time or together, had the same teacher, and I think it was Jellema, who taught at Calvin College.
And that's right. Yeah.
So which is just interesting, but so Plantinga, in the same way, says, well, we can assume, as Christians, we already believe in God. We just have that belief. That's a belief that was produced in us. So there's an idea within within the school of thought that they've kind of taken a different view of how we come to justify true belief. There was the discussion over warrant, and there's all sorts of things going on in analytic philosophy.
I have that trilogy of Plantinga's in my bookshelf in my living room.
Nice. Yep.
It's very very cool. Good. Yeah, it's a very, very good work.
That one was really good and powerful. But so there's this idea that not all of our beliefs have to be rationally evidenced or justified.
Yes.
We don't give evidence for all of our beliefs necessarily. Like,
you can't. I think the argument is that you can't.
Yeah, you can't. So the properly basic belief is something that the world or that
phrase.
Your experience of it produces in us. And so for instance, I look outside and it seems raining to me. I don't go through some kind of rational process to justify that, or I don't even have to sometimes justify that to you in a conversation. I just say, "Wow, it's raining outside. I didn't know it was supposed to rain today." And now the funny thing about that is they would be fallibilists in the sense that if
you could be wrong,
I could go outside and, oh yeah, my sprinkler system's
you
going.
could be wrong.
Yeah. So there's, but still that experience produced that belief. So the idea is,
and so God,
yeah. So for a Christian, we happen to believe God is true. That belief was produced in us. Maybe, we heard our parents told us, or we, accepted Christ at a rally, or we read the Gospel of John, or maybe some crazy life event happened to us and we're like, that doesn't all have to be mystical. It's just that belief was produced in us. We have it. It's natural for us. And so the idea is, unless we have defeaters for those beliefs, like going outside and seeing, the sprinkler is on.
Yeah.
Or if there are defeaters, I have defeaters for the defeaters. Like something then seems to be not the case, but then I realize, oh no, there's this other angle, and this is true. And that's just how basically they're trying to explain, this is how we normally go about our lives. And you don't come up with all sorts of evidences or try to stack up to theism, and then but that Christians have this basic belief that it was produced in us. And so for a Christian, so basically they'll say is like, okay, so all the things that say, well, belief in God is just belief in it's your way to have the security of the Father. It's a projection, Feuerbach, projection of the Father into the sky. Well, or Marx, it's just your way of getting ahead. It's an economic situation, or something else. Nietzsche, I forget the triad that Plantinga uses of philosophers, but basically people trying to explain away belief, or, well, you just believe this because this. You just believe in God, or you happens to be real for you because you're in a cultural condition, social cultural conditioned situation, or you want a divine Father or something like that. The idea is, what Plantinga just kind of responds, and, well, that you would have to understand that if that were the case, if God wasn't true, but you'd have to show that God wasn't true.
Exactly. So God is like
said everyone else is having these experiences globally of the divine and historically, and so for them they just start there, and then they respond to defeaters of the
so Plantinga moves God into a properly basic belief. Like for Christian, that's just what you do. He's just properly basic. There's no need to justify that belief, because we all have, like you said, there's all sorts of beliefs that can't be justified, that the rationalist or the materialist would have, but they start with it. So Christians are able to, and it's obviously probably more complicated than that.
We're kind of sketching it out.
We're sketching it, but I think that's pretty what it is. I think at its core, it's sort of like Plantinga standing up for the everyman. The everyday Christian. It's like, that's okay. You can believe it. That's you don't have to you don't have to prove that. Like, so it's I think there's a real nice commoner effect that Plantinga does that I find to be delightful. That he isn't just like, he is a towering academic, but like not really in the sense of like he doesn't think he's better. There's that video, remember he was on the news, that news channel, because his AC broke, and it's like so funny how like that just completely relates to like.
I'm gonna find that and post that in the comments. Yeah,
you should. It's really funny, especially if you've like engaged his work more. It's like he's just talking about his air conditioner. It's so great. Like, it's so funny.
But he does it like a philosopher. That's what's funny. He does it like I feel like I'm reading a portion of his book. The AC.
Yeah, the AC model is like part of his epistemological. That's what's funny about it. It's
Aquinas, Calvin. Yeah.
Yeah, the Aquinas Calvin. That's what. Yeah. So.
Oh.
I'm not going to get into that now because that's not part of what we're doing here. But I recommend reading Planning if you're willing and able. It's good to read. He's got a couple good, more like lower level.
Yeah, he summarized
books.
his thought.
Yeah, he summarized it in.
It's over there on my shelf. Yeah, I have one of his that he kind of summarizes his epistemology. Yeah, he takes those 3 big trilogy books and brings it on something 100 pages.
I can't think of what it is, but yes, yeah. I'm actually giving it to somebody. I never got it back, which is definitely probably the case for a lot of my books. I just have to buy new ones that I had before because I'm like, I need that back. But they can have it. I'll just buy another one. Which my wife loves because she loves how many.
Yeah.
Just kidding. I mean, she does. It's.
I hear you. I'm in the same boat.
It's kind of clutter I like. Lots and lots of books. It's the kind of clutter I can deal with. That's the only kind of clutter I can deal with. But so, in terms of like our stories, I think. I mean, if you want me to go first, I can jump in and sketch out my journey through the apologetics.
Yeah, you go first. Jump in.
Yeah. So it's hard. It's actually hard for me to even think about where I even began because it was a while ago now. 10, 12 years ago, I like got into it. And I think a lot of it was encountering atheism just because I was in bands for a long time. So when you're in like hardcore metal bands,
that was huge in the metal scene. I don't know why. Like all your friends were reading Richard Dawkins or something.
All of them were reading Dawkins and thinking they were real cool and edgy. And I'm like, nah, dude, I'm a Christian. Like Jesus, loves me, and I couldn't live otherwise. So, I'm not gonna do this weirdo, angry, condescending thing that Dawkins likes to do. So I think part of it was encountering a lot of that stuff and not knowing what to do with it. When you're a new Christian, I became a Christian when I was around 18, so. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. That wasn't part of my life growing up. So when you encounter that stuff as a new Christian, it sort of sets some stuff off for you that you're like, okay, what am I going to do about this? Because I didn't really. So then I think I turned to the Westminster Theological Seminary had they put classes up on the iTunes podcast.
iTunes U. You remember when there was iTunes U? That was awesome.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a big part of my development. But I also, which is funny, I never read The Case for Christ. That was not I know there's a lot of entryway for people into apologetics. Is the least, which is totally cool. Like Lee Strobel, which is great. It's fine. It's a good starting point for some people. The evangelical, I think, like we talked about before, that's sort of the evangelical. But it's just funny to think about this. And then I did that, and then Facebook was really starting to get popular, and then I think I just stumbled across. It must have been a post about William Lane Craig or something, and that sort of set me down the path, right? So I found William Lane Craig. I bought some of his books. What's that? On Guard? Is that his, right? On Guard.
On Guard.
This is On Guard is sort of his he's written a lot and published a lot and really smart guy. So I started on that, and then I started kind of getting into the sort of classical. I really was like, okay, this is some good stuff. Like Craig's talking about a lot of things that I need to hear. He's talking about a lot of stuff that I'm sort of dealing with some of these people, and so it was very helpful. And then a few years down the road, I started to have, because just to get more personal, one of my thoughts and concerns I had when I became a Christian is well, am I really even a Christian, or am I just a Christian because my friends are? And how am I? I'm not going to probably last as a Christian because I'm not good enough. I can't really finish things in my life, so I'm probably not going to be able to last long in this. So that was a real existential sort of threat for me for a very long time. And So, which is, I think people do wrestle with that. I've talked to some people who've had similar experiences. And so after a while, like Craig's stuff was just not doing it for me anymore. I was like, this is just not enough. Like, yeah, like, so it's sort of like moved in this evidentialist phase where it's like, man, even if there is a lot of evidence, that still doesn't really mean that God does exist. Like, it doesn't really mean that. Like, it's more probable, right? So if you're an evidentialist, it's like it's highly probable. Ultimately, you can't really say with any sense of certainty, which I don't necessarily say that either because I don't think that's the right word. Um, so it really became like an emotional, psychological, existential issue for me. And then and somehow I stumbled into Alvin Plantinga and the Reformed epistemology world. I'm like, oh, thank God! Like this is much better. Like this makes more sense to me. Um, and so through Plantinga, and around this time too is when theology became very, very, very important to me. More because sometimes the people in the apologetics world think that they're doing theology, but that's not really what they're doing. And then you sort of mistaken yourself for thinking you're doing theology because you're a Christian apologist, but that's not that. You mean, like, I'm not trying to be insulting, but you're not doing theology like proper. Like theology is for the church, and it's done within in the framework of the church, and obviously apologetics are a part of. They're doing it for the church, but it's different than doing theology. So there's like a
Yeah, theology is doxology. It's
worship.
done in the church. Apologetics
Mhm.
is done for the church too, but it's just trying to answer questions from
It's
that
different.
worship space that we've already, like, why in the world are you worshiping Jesus? Like, aren't we supposed to not worship any other gods? And so Christians
Yeah.
respond, and it also becomes
Yes.
part of the theological. So
Uh huh.
there is a dialogue between apologetics, but yeah,
Yeah.
if you overdo, I see what you're saying. I've had a similar
Hmm.
thing where you overdo the apologetics, like you're not doing
Yeah.
any of the theology and making it cohere. Yeah,
You're more like you're abstracting theology from its context and trying to
yeah,
use it for the gain of arguments or rationality. And it's like, yeah, theology can never be abstracted from the church. Once you like really start digging to like theology proper, you're like, oh, okay. Like, and even but so I was reading a lot of Karl Barth. Then Karl Barth was like he's a really important figure in my life. And then Kierkegaard came along. Soren Kierkegaard, a sort of Dutch existential, for kind of the first existentialist, technically, that the way that sort of the history of philosophy thinks about things. Lutheran, but he's a theologian too. When I started reading him, my whole world just completely changed, I think, and it opened me up and got me ready for like sort of James K. Smith, like Desiring the Kingdom, um, uh, sort of postmodern. His book about Who's Afraid of Postmodernity, which please everybody, that's going to be on my recommendation at the end of Five Guys. Is like, but so I'm not going to talk about that now. But then, so in my views have really shifted also with when David Bentley Hart also came. When I read The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, and Bliss by David Bentley Hart, that really pushed me in the direction of sort of a classical Christianity, divine simplicity, divine immutability, these sort of classical doctrines that a lot of the apologetics world were critiquing because they abstracted it from the context of scripture and from the context of the church. They wanted it to view it as complete, to abstract it as a philosophical doctrine, like divine simplicity is just purely philosophical, like abstract, like whatever. But then once you put it in its context and you put it in the framework of how God reveals himself in scripture and how Christianity becomes this coherent picture, these doctrines become necessary. So once I bit the bullet. Oh, and also Molinism, also to get into that world, was a big part of my development as well in the apologetics world. Like Luis de Molina, who was like
yeah.
uh, he just talked about God as this middle knowledge, to where all these counterfactuals of things that could have happened, or in terms, like
It's seen as like a midway point between Calvinism and Arminianism for those who
right,
might be
sort of
familiar
like
with that
right. So
debate.
like Calvinism is like the hyper predestinarian. The
Double
Arminian are more like it's
predestination.
based on double predestination,
Mm-hmm.
or like the Arminian who talks about humans have freedom and God chooses and the foreknowledge of who's going to choose faith.
Mm-hmm.
And Calvinism talks about God chooses you not because of your faith, not because of any choice you made, but because it's unconditional.
Mm-hmm.
And then Molinism talks about trying to bridge that gap and trying to solve some of the complicated issues that come with both extremes.
Mm-hmm.
But once I bit the bullet on a classical Christian perspective on God, I had to abandon like Molinism, and I had to almost abandon Reformed epistemology. Not entirely, because I think there's some of it I still carry with me, like we all do. We all carry our. But I agree. Like I'm at the spot now where it's like when Kierkegaard, that truth is subjectivity. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Now that sounds very bad to some
Yeah, you're
people
not
because
saying
they think
it's subjective in the sense that it's just in my imagination, but it's not really anything real.
yes. So that's
but
not what
but
subject.
it's
Even
what's
Kierkegaard doesn't
going
give
on
me
in your
subjectivity on
yeah.
that.
It is a real perspective. Yeah.
Well, it's what you're encountering in the world, and does it encounter your own being? Are you encountering it with your entire being? Is your
Mm-hmm.
whole world given meaning by this truth? Because if it's
Mm-hmm.
just a truth that's held out at a distance, like because he critiqued sort of
You're
state
like, oh,
church
I
stuff,
believe in
and
God, but yeah.
yeah, I believe in God, I believe in Christianity, but like I believe in those doctrines, and that's what makes me a Christian. It's like he's like, no, your encounter with the risen Lord is what makes you a Christian, not your adherence to this doctrine or that doctrine. So once that kind of got into me, and then like David Bentley Hart came in, and then like radical orthodoxy, like John Milbank, Catherine Pickstock, even Paul Tyson is another guy. Um, there's a very different way about going about theology, philosophy. It's sort of like, you know, it doesn't see these as divergent paths. It doesn't see theology and philosophy as like a different sort of in different realms. It actually sees theology as the queen of all things, and then in those things comes science and philosophy, and it starts out that way. And even Catherine Pickstock in her book, which I have on my bookshelf back there, it's called Aspects of Truth, which was my favorite book of I think 2019, and I tweeted at her and she thanked me. I was like, "Yeah, I love you, Catherine Pickstock," but it's so nerdy because she's not like it's very very specific, but just about the way that she tries
That's
to
awesome.
psychology that bring back truth into psychology, right? Like you don't both sort of ways of because she in that book she sort of argues that like both ways of like the analytic and the continental aren't really getting the complete picture, and that she uses Kierkegaard as like a Kierkegaardian, like a Platonic Kierkegaard is like the way forward for Christian metaphysics and just stuff in general. So that's sort of where I have stumbled on, and I no longer really read any sort of apologetics books. I'm more into primary source like theology and philosophy. Like I'm not reading guys that are trying to bring those things like secondarily. I'm trying to just read like the primary source of thinkers and things, and but that's just where I'm at, just being a graduate student and just doing that's just where I'm at these days. It didn't
Yeah.
start out like that. It started out with me reading secondary and third sources and trying to understand and know that because of my deep desire to not fall away from
Yeah.
being a Christian because I was so scared about it, which is just interesting to think about now. But I think people do experience that, and I think you should follow that experience because it's led me to a really, really wonderful place in the life of faith
Yeah.
and with God. So, but I'd love to hear where your journey is, and I think it's similar in some ways, but
Yeah.
different in others. So I'd love to hear
Yeah. I think
what your journey is like.
I think we mentioned in the first podcast we did, we kind of introduced ourselves. I kind of went through a crisis of faith myself. I'd grown up in the church, pastor's kid, and just kind of, but it's just a coming of age thing. If unless you're in a cult, I mean, if you're grown up in the church, there's a certain time when you have to kind of own your faith. You're growing up, and so your parents aren't going to make you go to church all the time. And so for me, though, it was in my 20s, and I had just gotten married, and I had this sense of like, okay, well, like someday I'm going to be a dad, so I got to take responsibility of what I believe. And I was getting, I had, it was that time, I know you talked about this, and we had that common experience where they're, our friends are like losing their faith because they're reading like goofy books. Like, I mean, I'm not saying there's some really good atheists out there and some really challenging atheists.
Yes.
That I really appreciate, but the new atheist
some of the popular stuff is not. That's not worth it.
It's kind of what it did is it helped a certain kind of teenager be what they wanted to be. But
yes, we also listen to similar sorts of music, so I think like we sort of we're in similar sorts of places with music and stuff like that. So that's sort of why we had that common experience.
Yeah, I think so. And so my brother-in-law recommended I'm a crazy guy. I guess like I'll talk to anybody about stuff if they'll let me, sometimes I'm shy,
Yeah, me too.
But so I mean when I was struggling, I reached out, I reached out to people I knew, and I know even people in our church, but I think the thing that got me started on apologetics and just trying to think about my faith in general, so theology and philosophy, was my brother-in-law, who himself was in Bible college and had just graduated, and we went to visit him, and I was talking to him about some stuff, and he's like, oh yeah, well, you should read Case for Christ. And so our church kind of was just like handing him out or something. Like, so somehow I got a free copy.
As they still do. Yeah.
As they still do. Yeah. It's the evangelical sort of, first defense. And
exactly.
I think there's a movie out too, but no, I read that and it was interesting and exciting. It did help me, as a Christian. It kind of strengthened my faith to know, there's actually professional academics out there who still believe in God, because that was the thing for whatever reason. It helped. It helped to know there are people like Plantinga, people like William Lane Craig, and so then I was able to lean into that. And I'd look up people. I discovered N.T. Wright early on. I don't know if he was in that book or not, but N.T. Wright, I would download some of his stuff on baptism and some of his stuff on Paul and Jesus, and then I began reading his books, and so he was a big deal for me too, and William Lane Craig too. But then I started getting into presuppositional apologetics, and I can't remember what set me in that direction. I think
was it Frame? Was it John Frame?
Actually, well, Frame was one of the guys that I really like because he's a good thinker, and he carefully writes his sentences so that you can really he's very careful to make sure that you understand what he's saying.
He's sharp.
Yeah,
he's sharp.
Very
I agree.
Sharp. I like Frame. No, he was one of the people I leaned into as I got into presuppositionalism, but I think I was first introduced to presuppositionalism because I was getting into eschatology, and I was losing my faith in the rapture theology, the dispensational stuff, and I was just reading every view I could, Amil, and I had run across the postmillennials, which in the preterists, and I was getting into preterism, partial preterism, and like R.C. Sproul's a partial preterist, and
R.C. Sproul is?
Yeah.
Or was?
Yeah.
I don't know that.
He's a postmillennial partial preterist, and he has a book on that too, and I forget what it's called off the top of my head.
See, I never really read Sproul. That was never a part of my journey. I saw him later on. I was more well, that's yeah.
Yeah, I
Continue
started.
on your story. I
Well, I
never read
should
that
say
stuff.
this because once I started getting into apologetics and stuff, I was one of those young restless reform guys. You know, they always talk
Oh, you
about,
one of them? Huh? You
yeah,
one of them guys?
yeah, one of them dudes, and
One
I
of
was
them.
getting into Reformed theology, and I gotten into,
Mhm.
but through postmillennialism, started reading the Reconstructionists like R.J. Rushdoony, and
Sure.
David Schulten was the one that kind of he has a book on Revelation that got me into
Hmm.
that. But then reading Gary North and these stuff. But I come from like I told you, I was more of a socialist before I was really
Oh yeah,
like a
sure. Politically,
Christian,
yeah.
kind of some kind of Christianized version of it. And
Hmm.
so like it was kind of hard for me to take in some of those guys. And I was, before I had discovered the reform stuff, I was into emergent guys and stuff like that until I got
Hmm.
sick of it and was like, no, reform theology is so much better. And
Trash. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I was into that for a while, and then I kind of started losing that. Uh, I I started losing the double predestination thing, and
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
Molinism was always kind of fishy to me. Like I was into it for a little bit, but
Hmm.
it was too underdeveloped, I think. When
Yeah. I think
I,
that's true. I think it's too overly speculative too about
yeah,
God's knowledge.
too speculative. But yeah, I'd always been
Yeah.
kind of interested in the Eastern even before I was on that journey. I was interested in Eastern Orthodox,
They
and
also play a real the
yeah,
East plays a real big development for me as
yeah,
well.
for you
Even though
too.
I keep
Yeah,
forgetting to mention it, but it's like,
yeah, I think
my
that's
gosh, like when you start to encounter the East, it's like,
yeah,
dude, what, like this sort of apologetic stuff is just trash. Like I can't, like it pales in comparison to
yeah,
what the East has like held on to and taught for
yeah,
thousands of years. So
yeah. So yeah.
yeah.
So anyway, yeah. And then apologetics. I was into presuppositionalism for a while, and um, but I started drifting more. I think when I started reading, well, I guess the more primary sources and like
Hmm.
philosophy and stuff, because I wanted to dig deeper, and was taking some
Yeah.
courses, and I had um I had decided I was just kind of sick of the way apologetics was going. I think it was the modernist kind of thing, everybody trying to just
Hmm.
convince everybody. And so it's interesting, it helped me in my own faith on my journey, but I realized no one comes to faith that way necessarily. I mean, some people say they do or whatever, but I think it's really
It's
because
possible.
they,
Yeah.
yeah, and so presuppositionalism, um, and I would say Planiga too. Like I wanted to kind of blend all that together. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think I kind of got in this place where I was just sick of the way it was um, going, and I think for now, as I look back, and I think reasons that are more similar to your story, where you just want to be more into the theology, and I
Hmm.
really
Yeah.
resonated with that. So um, yeah, I think to getting more into like Karl Barth, and then the philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd. He's a Dutch Reformed
Yeah.
philosopher
Hmm.
who influenced Van Til and
Hmm.
a lot of the presuppositionalists in certain ways. But I started gravitating more towards him, and then reading a lot of continental philosophy and postmodern
Hmm.
philosophy, and a lot of things like Stanley Hauerwas and stuff, and really getting
Yeah.
into that. And I think there was a point where I read Myron Bradley Penner's book, The End of Apologetics, and he's a
Mm.
Kierkegaardian kind of guy, and I really
Hmm.
just kind of yeah. Because here's the
Yeah.
thing, and this I learned this in presuppositionalism too. I think all the arguments for God's existence have holes in them. Really, they're just
Of course they do.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're just presupposition. They're just sorry. There's presuppositions we have about God, and then we're trying to reason to them in certain ways. But then I think too, just discovering even Aquinas in his 5 proofs for God's existence was doing something different than we're doing today.
Very different.
Like I feel
very different. I agree.
Yeah, the way it's coming across to me is a kind of emergency, like get yourself to believe again. And I think that's because, you know, it's like Charles Taylor's Secular Age. I think we're just in a moment right now where it seems like the default is this kind of, I don't know what the default is now after 2020, but the default, at least for a while, in the Western culture has been this kind of mechanistic view of the universe, a kind of disenchanted view. But then enchantment keeps popping up anyway, and that's the point of the Secular Age. But yeah, I think so I got to this place where just kind of it all kind of fell apart. But then now, you know, as I kind of rewind, I was kind of thinking about this for our podcast this week. I'm not against doing apologetics. I think within the tradition of the church, I think I think it's something that can grow out of the, you know, here's what I think of. You go to your priest and you say, you know, I always wondered about this, or I'm really struggling with my faith, the problem of evil or something. Then your priest gives an answer. The priest is giving an answer within the tradition and that lived faith that he's been handed. And he's working with all sorts of things. I mean, this accumulated history that we have of the faith. And I think Alistair McIntyre is the one who's influenced me to really say, look, if you're going to ditch Christianity for something else, it has to be better. It has to like be encompass that what we're getting and what we're getting culturally and socially and personally from the Christian tradition. And so that's what even led him ultimately.
Have you read After Virtue?
Faith. Yes.
Have you read After Virtue? Yeah.
That's good.
Good. It's very I've read through some of it, not through all of it. Been trying to get a group together around here to read through it because I'm like, I kind of want to read it with like other people.
Oh, that'd
be fun.
Because
it'd be fun to like just. It'd be a lot of fun. But yeah, McIntyre, like Harwas, right? These guys are. Yeah,
they kind of. I guess that's kind of where I ended up.
McIntyre's doing a little bit ethically.
Yeah, they're
right?
Yeah. Harwas is using McIntyre and stuff. So. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. So I mean, it's kind of like Justin Martyr when he's bearing witness, or he's trying to talk to Jews. You know, I think it's this kind of thing that I'm interested in. So, you know what it might look like today. Well, I'll tell you what I think it looks like today, like now. But and, you know, another thing it might be like, okay, well, it seems like the world evolved, and it really seems like that's what's going on. I wonder what that means. From, you know, given what we have in the tradition, you know, as God is creator of all things seen and unseen. And so, and as we go back and we look at Genesis and so forth. So, I mean, in other words, that's not like something that poses a tension for me anymore. It's something that I wonder how the church would answer how we answer this from where we're at theologically and from our doxology, from our living worship space, you know. So I think there's things like that are going on, and so I'm not like you're not under this pressure like, oh, we got to, you know, use intelligent design, or we have to, you know, do some kind of crazy stuff with the response to that, you know. Or I mean, an interesting thing to me, like stuff we're dealing with culturally now, where, you know, with the rise of the transgenderism and other things, even like posthumanism and stuff. To me, what I see is the church just has a different anthropology, and it's interesting as you interact with what's happening in the culture. There's things you can learn, you know, but you're not answering it to sort of get someone to believe. That's I think the difference. I'm not answering that to get belief, but maybe to help me on this journey in the Christian tradition, in the ecclesia, in
Yeah.
in the context of what we're doing. So, Christian friend who's gay, who's experiencing same-sex attraction, and the question is, well, is God going to destroy me because I'm gay? And we're like, well, what sin are you doing? Like, is that what we're talking about? Like,
Right.
what's,
Well, yeah.
but I think that as a Christian, though, even when it comes to male and female, men and women, those kinds of things, we just have a different anthropology right now than the world has. And I know that's hard. It's hard for some people, but
because it's at odds.
It's at odds, and so it's like Kierkegaard
is.
said. There's some, and I brought up something intentionally very controversial, because I think some people, when they hear me even start to talk about that, will shut it off, will turn this program off, which is, I think, where we're at today. And this is what I did want to say, is that I think where we're at today is, and why apologetics seems to not have a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of gas. I don't know what it's doing right now. Like, I don't know who's the
people can. I think people can easily ignore it.
Yeah,
that's just my perspective.
Yeah, and
people aren't really. It doesn't really make any difference.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is the question people have now, and as a youth pastor, question I know that I see my students ask is, how, I don't know if I can believe in Christianity because I don't know if it's on the right side of history anymore. They don't care about whether it's true or not. They're just saying, I don't know if it promotes justice, if it's for the oppressed, if it's for the poor, or it's not, or I don't know if it might be racist, those kinds of things. And I think it's because, of course it's it's kind of funny. You just read the Bible. It doesn't take much to say, Jesus was, I think even the word oppression and things like oppression, and of course things like justice, are terms in the Bible. But I think we have this weird kind of alien, politicized social justice view that I think is now influencing people in a way, and I think that needs to be critiqued and dissected and thought about itself. Like, it can't be immune to critique. So I think I think there'll be kind of a Christian, an interesting Christian answer from within the tradition that speaks carefully, and that's kind of even what I'm looking for when I think of those things. But I think the reason why apologetics doesn't do much is, I think now people are just like, they're just asking the question of I think there's a lot of things going on, kind of a purity culture going on in our world, where they want to stay clean. Yeah. So they want to stay clean. They don't want anything dirty. And so they want to know, if I accept Christ, if I'm in Christianity, is this going to promote justice? Is this going to make me dirty or impure, or hurt my profile, my public profile or something?
So it's like, so you're seeing it's primarily a political, like, imagination that people are now encompassed in, right? That's sort of what you're saying. Like, it's a hyper political cosmology that people are dwelling in, like young kids, like Gen Zers, and so I think part of, so like, if so what were you gonna say?
That's it. I think that, and so I think the temptation is for the church to then maybe cater to that and maybe say, well, we do need to show you that we're on the right side of history and we're going to be for this and that or whatever. But I think that's just only going to go so far. So I see less apologetics. It's a little
slippery. Yeah.
I see less apologetics and more kind of this approach to get, I don't know. I'm not sure. I see a lot of different things. I don't think there's a one way the church is responding.
Yeah.
Some of it's responding really goofy. Yeah. But
well, I think so. Just to part of what I see a lot of the apologetics movement is responding to new atheism and to that movement, right? So they're still like engaging in that way.
Yeah.
And even academically, you have Christians that are doing academic philosophy really well. You know, my a friend of mine, acquaintance of mine, Tyler McNabb, did his whole dissertation on planning his Reformed epistemology, and he teaches at Baylor, and I think it's Baylor. And so there's partly what I see is there are different levels of engagement, and the sort of philosophical, academic, high academic stuff is not as important to the church right now as it is to understand how we respond to the cultural waves of the hyper political, ideological frame we're in. And apologetics doesn't really offer much to that. I don't think anything substantial. I think it only offers answers to questions that nobody's really asking themselves right now. Maybe they will in 20 years and they could come back again. Like most things are cyclical. So for me, I think there's good elements to apologetics, like you said before. Like, I don't think I have a problem with people doing it. I think it needs to be put in its right framework, in a right context, because I agree with you that when you go to a priest or your pastor about how do I deal with this problem, like, they're not coming at it from like an abstract institution, academic institutional perspective. They're coming at it from the ground, from the, at least if they're a good pastor, they're coming at it from lived experience and like interacting with multiple different kinds of people in different kind of contexts, and the tradition is just such an endless well where the Spirit has been working and developing theology and answers, and partly what I think too is that the world is just craving like deep beauty, because everything around us is just I saw a popular TV show host who I'm not going to name because people really dislike this person, but I saw him give a speech in a country about railing against brutalist architecture. And I don't know if this may seem like it won't connect right now, but he just talked about how the way that modern architecture is meant to dehumanize you. And I was like, yeah, like it's meant to show you that when you're in nature, when you're in like a field of grass and you feel the sun and you see the sky and you see animals and birds bustling about, you're brought face to face with not only your contingency, but with like beauty and transcendence in a way that like it will last beyond you. Like, this field of grass will last beyond you in your life. But what that does is it also makes you human again, because you recognize your spot in the cosmic order. And, there's a way that urban architecture, as opposed to like more of a, how would I put it, an ornamental, like, think about like a classic, like a cathedral from like the medieval times, right? Or like, think about that kind of architecture, the way that it points up, the way that it lifts you up when you see it. It's so like beautiful and ornamental, and it, to quote Roger Scruton, the ornamental saves us from the tyranny of the useful. And so for me, like, apologetics in terms of philosophically, it's uninteresting to me because it doesn't really answer these deeper level questions, about who we are. I mean, it attempts to answer those questions abstractly, but Christianity has a deeply embodied vision of who human beings are and what they were created for. And they weren't created to just to have an infinite, endless amount of choices to express themselves. That we weren't supposed to have that kind of burden, right?
Yeah,
so,
and I think, and I think there's something else that's kind of, with apologetics that I think can be a problem, and I think it's, and I'm not sure what I think anymore about all the different methods. I would probably still be somewhat presuppositionalist, but like in a Doiveridian way, or like Planning or something. If we're trying to, piece all those together, but I don't think there's a method or script one should follow. I think it's something that,
No.
and so you see this especially within presuppositionalism, some of the ways that it almost can come off as kind of scripted and goofy. But
Oh yeah. Big time.
I think that the methods are kind of distracting right now, and I think with the
Mhm.
philosophical approaches and some of those things, like you said, I think there's a place for it, and it probably some really good work is being done or whatever, but it's just not on the
Oh
radar
yeah.
for a lot of
Yeah. No
folks.
doubt.
And I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think our distractions are good all the time. But I do think, there has to be, and I think this goes back to this, that I think the real, that's interesting you brought out beauty and aesthetics, because I think I almost agree,
Hmm.
more with the idea that someone is persuaded more by their experiences.
Hmm.
And in fact, even these philosophical arguments and so forth, they want to have those experiences of knowing them and learning them. But it's the experiences that we say are these sacramental promises, is where God
Hmm.
promises to meet us when we encounter Him in the Eucharist, when we encounter Him in the Word, when we encounter Christ. And I think ultimately, um, what we're trying to do is invite people into a space and kind of taste and see that the Lord is good.
This
Then
is funny. I actually our sermon today at church this morning. My pastor talked
mm-hmm.
about how it's so funny you brought up the take because it's exactly what he talks about. It's like we have to understand. We asked ourselves the question: what makes life worth living?
Mm-hmm.
Is it philosophical arguments that make life worth living? Like, definitely not. It makes life maybe not worth living. But to be really silly, but he says you can't understand that God is good by looking at your circumstances or evidence, but only by tasting Him and tasting and seeing that He is good, right? So, like, I think
Mm-hmm.
it is Eucharist and the
Yeah.
supper and incense and stuff like that
Yeah.
is a way in which we understand who God is. Because if we
Mm-hmm.
go back to like Kierkegaard, like if you're only just thinking of God as like an object to gain information about, or like an adherence of doctrine,
Yeah.
and like you don't know God at all. Actually,
Yeah.
you're actually probably actively hiding from experiencing God
Mm-hmm.
because of how like terrifying it can be to
Mm-hmm.
encounter the living Creator. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good point. That like just to bring up aesthetics and beauty, where like which is our sort of where we're a
That's
second
what we
episode,
want.
like
Yeah.
fundamentally where we're moving
A
from,
base.
right? It's
Mm-hmm.
from it's from like the base is about lived experience and how the tradition is where we can nest ourselves to know that like there's a well of defense of the faith. Like there's plenty of
Mm-hmm.
good defense there, which I think is necessary for Christians just to go deeper. Because I don't want to tell anybody to not. Because I only got to this place by digging deeper and working through
Mm-hmm.
problems.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah. You
if
get
you're
to a
just going to
place where
ignore it, or
it breaks
yeah,
down, though, and whenever it breaks down, that's
exactly,
because
exactly,
our encounters with the true and living God, and that's what changes us.
yeah,
And so the arguments, the ideas, they will break down because they're not the foundation. It's the radical
exactly.
lived experience of with God. I think
Hmm.
I think that's definitely where it is. Well, can you how about you give
Yeah.
us book recommendations?
So I'll venture out to do. It's funny. I was thinking about it, and I'm just trying to get good. So there's like three books that I would recommend that were pretty crucial. One being
Case for
The
Christ?
Experience
No,
of
I'm sorry.
God, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel.
Yeah.
Um, no, I think The Experience of God by David Bentley Hart is an accessible enough book for everybody. I think for the most part, I think you have to have some at least experience reading this. But the way that he sort of talks about one of the main problems of even apologetics, if as we were critiquing it, it's like often we're speaking completely different languages, right? Like as a Christian talking to an atheist, we're talking about something different. Like the Dawkins tried to engage Thomas Aquinas' five proofs. He's completely missing the mark because he's not even speaking the same language as Aquinas, right? God is and Hart gets into this, like God is not like a finite being. He's not another thing among things. He's the origin of all life and all existence. He out of him comes existence, right? So he's infinitely other, and to say that God doesn't exist, like we said before, like we can say that because of course he doesn't exist, because he doesn't have non-existence as his opposite. So I think that's a really good book for people who are maybe at the end of their rope with apologetics a little bit. I think Hart offers a really nice way out of the modern trap of thinking about God, which I think is really part of what the nesting ourselves in the Christian tradition is really important, because we need to be rooted in who God really is, and that you can find that in the Christian tradition. The second book I would say is the book I mentioned earlier, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism by James K. Smith. I think he does such a good job of showing how this new sort of age that we're in, post-modernity, is actually a great opportunity for Christianity to sneak itself in there, because it gives the best explanation. I think he says, I saw him give a talk at Wheaton once about Augustine is like the postmodern saint, where he says that Smith talks about how the postmodern philosophy has sort of, it gives the Augustine diagnosis of reality, but it doesn't take his the medicine that Augustine offers. So there's like this really cool, Smith is such an interesting guy. Who's Afraid of Postmodernism is another book I would recommend. And then third is that the Plantinga book that you mentioned, Knowledge and Christian Belief, is the sort of lay level 100-page, 144 pages succinctly explaining his perspective. And I think that is a really healthy way for people to, I think, just engage in dialogue with atheists and other people of faith. Planning is a good way of a good nesting spot, I think, to use that phrase, which I like a lot for some reason, because I found planning it to be a very helpful friend in the journey. There's not a lot of thinkers I would say that I felt were sort of a friend, but Planning is one of those ones who, like I said, he brought the seriousness for the everyman, and I think that's something that is really worth holding on to as Christians, just generally, especially people who are apologists, if you want to say that. Which is another reason why I abandoned it, because I don't want to be a Christian apologist. I was not interested in that title. But I think if we're going to do that, like, we need to be for the everyman. We need to be for the everyday person, the everyday Christian, which is found in the life of the church. It's never abstracted from that, right? The everyday person isn't going to go read like these philosophical journals and these like sort of really heavier stuff, because people are just trying to live day by day. They're trying to get by. So how do we best bring that, bring the weight and meaning of Christianity to every person who is not an academic, who isn't doing philosophy, and because that's where the Spirit resides ultimately, right? Is with those on the margins, not those in the ivory towers. Even though he is there as well, but like you catch my drift.
Absolutely.
It's not. I think that's too. Just before you give your recommendations, another problem I have with apologetics is that it's like, I look at I would go to Christian worship services thinking like, I need a really heady like sermon. I need them to really dig into like the evidence and the philosophical argument. It's like, what a lame way of thinking about church. Like, what a stupid, boring,
Yeah.
uninspiring way of thinking about how God encounters people. Like through which God does clearly. People get encountered in philosophy through that, but like, you go to church to like be encountered by the triune Lord in His Word and the supper and baptism and for people. Yeah. So again, David Bentley Hart's The Experience of God, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism by James K. Smith, and Knowledge and Christian Belief by Alvin Flanagan. Those are my 3 recommendations.
Awesome, and we'll post those in the comments as links.
Yeah.
So
How about
you can
you?
click
How
on
about
those.
you?
Do
you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I actually went a little overboard. Only because I'm like, there's like 20
Good.
books.
I didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
But so I'll just mention them quickly.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So the one I think that's good for just kind of trying to get, I don't know if my camera's gonna let this work or not. Mapping.
Oh, is that the Penner book?
This is actually Brian K. Morley, Mapping Apologetics. This just kind of for someone that is like, oh, I'm interested in all these different ways of doing it, these different methods or approaches. He tries to kind of summarize them, critique them, and then offer his own, kind of, here's a grab bag, or here's how we kind of can borrow from all of them and do what I do. But
a cumulative case.
Yeah, cumulative case.
And maybe, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Could be. But yeah, I mean, I guess when I remember, that's how I remember him concluding. But that's a good one. It just helps you get in the thick of it. The one that I think this is Myron Penner's book, The End of Apologetics. I think that one is good. He, like I said, he talks about his journey and how he had more. He's like you. He got more into Kierkegaard, and then he just was kind of got sick of the whole apologetics.
Did I tell you Kierkegaard tattooed on my arm?
That's awesome.
I have it. I'll have to. You continue on your. I'll show it in a minute.
Okay.
You continue your recommendations.
Okay. Awesome. And of course, I chose David Bentley Hart, being Consciousness and Bliss, the Experience of God.
Hey.
So.
That's the stuff.
Yep.
That's the one.
Yeah, that one I think is good because that's awesome.
Right there. It's right there. It's
That's
like
cool.
it's upside down, but
I see it.
You're probably not going to encounter a lot of people having Kierkegaard portraits by their right armpit,
Yeah.
Yeah. It's my favorite one, probably.
That's good. Yeah, and then the next 2 are a pair. They go together. Roy Clauser, he's a philosopher, very much kind of in the vein of Herman Doiverd, who I mentioned, and he does a really good job sort of explaining Doiverd and then kind of using him in his own way. So the myth of religious neutrality is kind of his big book but he's good, and he's one too where I realized, well, I realized this before, but I like his approach where he kind of shows all the arguments for God's existence don't work. Here's what we're really doing. Here's what works, and so I liked his. And then
it might be scary for some people to hear.
I know,
like none of them work. It's like,
yeah, what do I do? Okay, so
okay.
if that just crashed you, go check out Roy Clauser. You can check out his lectures online too. They posted a few of them on YouTube. Knowing with the Heart is his kind of small book. It's like a conversation with an atheist, and so he's kind of explaining his view as he goes. And I liked that one.
Yeah.
So I think these are good ones for apologetics.
Those are great. Those are great recommendations. Yeah.
Yeah, and they'll at least get someone, if you're kind of ready to move on to like a next level, or you're just kind of done with the apologetic scene, like there's something missing. Maybe you've resonated with our conversation. I think these book recommendations will help. So.
Yeah.
Together. Well, thank you, and thanks for joining us on the Discerning the Forms podcast. We're excited to be on our 3rd episode, and we'll have more coming.
Yep. Next week.
Yep. Next week. See ya.
See ya.